General Hospital will reveal after the video of Gio violently smashing his violin spread across social media like wildfire. The quiet stability of Port Charles was shaken, but no one more than Rocco. For a boy who had grown up believing he understood his family, the video became a gateway to a devastating truth that hit with the force of a storm. At first, it was confusion. Why was Gio so angry? And why did it matter so much to everyone? But as the video went viral, so did the speculation. And with that speculation came names that were painfully familiar: Dante and Brooke Lynn. Rocco scrolled through endless comments, memes, and gossip threads, and each word cut deeper than the last. There were photos of Gio standing beside Brooke Lynn, blurry screenshots of Dante looking away during interviews, and captions screaming betrayal, secrecy, and scandal. The digital world knew something that Rocco didn't, something vital. Something life-altering. And the moment he saw his father's name attached to phrases like, "the man who hid his son for nearly 2 decades, the world Rocco knew shattered. Everything that had once been solid now felt like smoke in his hands. He replayed childhood memories, searching for cracks in the foundation: a misplaced look from Dante, an unfinished sentence from Lulu, a passing comment from someone who might have known too much. The realization that an entire chapter of his family's history had been deliberately kept from him ignited a painful sense of betrayal. And when Dante finally confirmed the truth, that Gio was his firstborn, Rocco's half-brother, it felt like a knife being twisted slowly. It wasn't just about the secret itself. It was about being left in the dark, about not being trusted with something that so directly affected his identity. Dante had spoken with remorse, trying to explain. Trying to connect the fragmented parts of a family that had never truly been whole. He told Rocco that he hadn't known about Gio until recently, that the truth had come to him in pieces, wrapped in regret and confusion. But none of it landed gently. To Rocco, the timing didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone else seemed to have known before him, even Gio, even the internet. And that made everything worse. His eyes, once full of admiration for the father who had protected and raised him, were now clouded with disbelief and pain. He looked at Dante and saw a stranger, someone who had built their relationship on half-truths and silences. The more Rocco thought about it, the more his thoughts spiraled. If Dante had lied about something this massive, what else had he hidden? Had Lulu known? And if she had, how long had she kept quiet? Rocco's mind raced through scenarios, each more disorienting than the last. He remembered moments when he had asked about his parents' past, about people from before he was born. And how those questions were always met with vague reassurances or quickly diverted attention. What once felt like normal parental boundaries now felt like calculated deceit. Worse still, the name Gio, once just a talented young musician from school, someone with a temper and a mysterious vibe, now carried a weight that Rocco wasn't prepared to shoulder. He had a brother. An older brother. And not just biologically, Gio had lived an entire life, full of experiences, traumas, and secrets that Rocco would never fully understand. The idea of sharing his father, of suddenly having to carve out emotional space for someone who was thrust into his life not by choice but by the unraveling of a secret, made Rocco feel lost in his own home. He couldn't sleep that night. The weight of it all pressed against his chest, making each breath feel like a struggle. In the early hours of the morning, he sat alone in his room, scrolling through Joe's public performances, interviews, and posts. He watched the rage in Joe's violin smashing, listened to the music in his softer moments, and for the first time, saw not a stranger, but someone broken. Someone like him. But the resentment remained. No matter how tragic Joe's story was, it didn't erase the betrayal. At breakfast, he sat silently across from Dante, the space between them heavier than ever. Dante tried to speak, but Rocco wouldn't meet his gaze. Every bite of food tasted like ash. The trust had been cracked. And no amount of explanation could glue it back instantly. Later that day, Dante tried something different. He asked if Rocco would be willing to meet Gio, to talk, just once. He didn't force it, he said it was Rocco's decision. And Rocco, still burning with anger but craving answers that only Gio could give, reluctantly agreed. The meeting was awkward, painfully so. Gio stood uncertain, not quite knowing how to approach a younger brother he hadn't asked for. Rocco crossed his arms, defensive, skeptical. Silence stretched between them until it was unbearable. Finally, Gio pulled something from his backpack, the broken pieces of the violin. He said he hadn't fixed it yet, that maybe some things couldn't be fixed easily. That maybe some things had to stay broken for a while, until people figured out what they wanted them to sound like again. It wasn't an apology, but it was honest. And for the first time, Rocco saw Gio not as a threat, but as a boy who had been just as blindsided as he was. There was no hug. No forgiveness. Just two brothers staring at each other across the divide. Trying to find their footing in the wreckage of truth. And as Rocco walked away from that meeting, unsure of what to feel, one thing was clear, the past had already been written. But what came next, that was still up to them. However, the one who was perhaps the most stunned of all was Gio. Despite being the person who accidentally overheard the earth-shattering truth backstage at the nurses' ball, Gio never imagined that he would eventually have to stand face to face with the younger brother he never knew he had, and certainly not in such a chaotic, emotionally volatile context. From the moment he laid eyes on Rocco, something inside Gio fractured. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sense of not belonging, of being the intruder in a story he had no say in. The look in Rocco's eyes, shock, confusion, betrayal, was enough to undo every scenario Gio had ever rehearsed in his head about what meeting a sibling might be like. 4 weeks. Since discovering the truth about his parentage, Gio had tried to prepare himself for this encounter. He had played out conversations in his mind. Imagined what he might say or how he might explain himself, but none of those carefully constructed internal dialogues survived the reality of Rocco's heartbreak. There was no script for this. No way to predict how a boy who had grown up believing he was an only child would react to the sudden appearance of a brother whose very existence had been hidden. Gio didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't expect welcome. In fact, he wasn't sure what he expected at all. He wasn't even sure he deserved to expect anything. All he knew was that Rocco now knew the truth. And somehow that truth, just the fact that it had been spoken aloud, made Gio feel exposed in a way he had never felt before. It was as if the secret had been the only thing tethering him to reality. And now that it was out, he was floating somewhere between guilt, resentment, and a yearning he didn't know how to express. He watched Rocco from a distance, unsure whether to step forward or to back away entirely. There was something about seeing someone who shared his blood but none of his memories that made Gio feel like a shadow. He had longed for connection, yes, but he never wanted to be forced upon anyone. And especially not a boy who had just had the ground ripped out from beneath him. In an effort to create a safe and hopeful environment for both his sons, Dante arranged a private meeting, a quiet, familiar space where the walls bore memories and not secrets. Where the tension might soften enough for honesty to take root. He hoped the right setting might act as a balm, a place where two young men could bridge the distance between them. Not as strangers but as brothers learning to breathe in the same emotional space. But the meeting, from the very beginning, was heavy with silence and unspoken tension. Rocco arrived first. His posture rigid, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood near the door, arms crossed, surveying the room like it was foreign territory. When Gio entered moments later, the air grew impossibly dense. Gio took a cautious step inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. His gaze immediately locking with Rocco's before darting to Dante and then quickly to the floor. His usual confidence, the kind he displayed on stage or in front of a camera, was absent. What replaced it was uncertainty, an invisible weight he carried on his shoulders, heavy with unspoken guilt and a longing to belong. Dante tried to guide the moment with gentle words and a hopeful tone, encouraging the two to simply talk, to find some common ground. But Rocco wasn't ready. He felt cornered. Like this meeting was less about healing and more about obligation. To him, it felt like he was being told to accept someone into his heart based solely on biology. And he wasn't sure he could, or even wanted to. Every time he looked at Gio, he didn't see a brother. He saw disruption. He saw the personification of all the lies and omissions that had fractured his relationship with his father. For Gio, sitting across from Rocco was excruciating. He noticed every twitch in Rocco's jaw, every time he looked away, every shift in posture that screamed discomfort. He tried to stay calm. To remind himself that Rocco had every right to feel betrayed. But no amount of mental rehearsal could steel him against the reality of rejection. Especially not from someone who, until recently, had been an abstract concept, what if, living in the background of other people's lives. He wanted to say something meaningful. Something that could open a door instead of closing it. But when he finally did speak, his voice trembled. He didn't try to explain himself, didn't try to justify the way the truth had come out. Instead, he offered what he thought was the only honest thing he could, an acknowledgement that he didn't expect anything. He wasn't asking Rocco to suddenly call him brother, or share family dinners or act like years of life apart could be undone in one afternoon. He only wanted Rocco to know that he was there. That he existed. And that if, one day, Rocco ever wanted to talk, Gio would be ready. Rocco didn't respond at first. His face remained stoic, his thoughts a storm behind tight lips. When he did finally speak, it wasn't with warmth, it was with pain. He asked Gio how long he had known, and why he hadn't said anything sooner. Joe's answers were careful but raw. He explained that he hadn't known for long, and that by the time he had confirmation, the secret had already become a weapon in someone else's war. He hadn't meant for Rocco to find out through gossip and scandal. If he could take it back, he would. But there was no taking it back. There was only this moment, uncomfortable, necessary. And steeped in a kind of emotional complexity that most adults would struggle to navigate, let alone two teenagers. When the meeting ended, it did not end in hugs or reconciliation. It ended with Rocco quietly standing, nodding once without meeting Joe's eyes, and walking out the door. Gio remained seated, staring at the spot where his brother had stood. Wondering if he had just lost something he never really had the chance to gain. Dante lingered behind, watching both his sons, each retreating into his own private universe of confusion and pain. He knew this wasn't the miracle reunion he had hoped for, but he also knew healing rarely came without first acknowledging the wound. As long as both boys knew the truth. As long as the lies had finally been stripped away, there was still hope that someday, somehow, a bond could be built, not on expectation, but on truth. And in the world of Port Charles, that kind of truth was the rarest gift of all. The discomfort in the room didn't linger in silence for long. It quickly evolved into something much sharper, tension so palpable it seemed to settle in the very air between them. Rocco, no longer able or willing to suppress the storm of emotions crashing inside him, began to unleash a barrage of pointed, unfiltered questions. His voice, though steady, was laced with hurt and accusation. Why had Dante kept this secret from him? Why had Brooke Lynn never once appeared in his life as a maternal figure or even a family friend? Why did Gio behave like he was the only one who had been wronged when Rocco had been blindsided by the truth of his existence? The questions poured out with increasing intensity. Each one a strike fueled by years of unknowing, a need for clarity, and the ache of betrayal. Dante sat across from his son, visibly shaken. Every question Rocco asked felt like a blade digging deeper into his guilt. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind for days, imagining how he might gently guide his son through the truth. But reality was far more raw and complicated than any of his preparations could account for. Dante tried to speak, to explain. To give voice to the pain he himself had endured upon learning that Gio was his son. He spoke of the anguish that came with realizing so much time had been lost. Of the remorse he carried for not being stronger, braver, of not telling Rocco sooner. He admitted to his failings, his paralysis in the face of the truth. And the paralyzing fear of how it might shatter the life they had built together. But as the words left his mouth, Dante could see they didn't carry the weight he had hoped. They hung in the air, flimsy and hollow against the magnitude of what had been done. To Rocco, these were just words, apologies given too late. Admissions that couldn't change the fact that a stranger had been living in the shadows of his family all along. The explanations, however sincere, felt like smoke, thin, ephemeral. And entirely incapable of calming the tempest swirling inside him. It was in that fraught silence, just before emotions might have spiraled into accusations and resentment, that Gio acted. He didn't speak. He didn't try to insert himself into the conversation with justifications or pleas. Instead, he reached into the bag slung over his shoulder and slowly walked toward Rocco. His steps were hesitant, unsure, but filled with intention. He stopped just a few feet away and extended a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Rocco looked at it warily. Then unwrapped the bundle to find the broken pieces of Joe's violin, the same one from the now infamous video. The strings were snapped, the wood cracked. The delicate craftsmanship marred by emotional violence. But even in its brokenness, the instrument held meaning. Gio looked Rocco in the eye and, with a voice quiet but steady, told him that he was learning how to repair it. That the process was slow, and painful, and full of uncertainty, but he wanted to fix it. Not just the violin, but the scattered, jagged pieces of his own life. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking to be accepted or embraced. This wasn't a plea, it was a truth. A quiet offering. An act of vulnerability from someone who had nothing left to protect himself with but honesty. There was no poetry in what Gio said, no rehearsed speech meant to tug at heartstrings. Just sincerity. Just a broken boy holding the pieces of something once beautiful and promising to try to make it whole again. And for Rocco, that moment, more than any words Dante had offered, hit something deep inside him. He didn't respond right away. He didn't move. But his fingers curled around the broken wood, and for the first time, his gaze lingered on Gio without anger. Still, acceptance is never immediate. It's a journey, not a switch. After a long, heavy pause, Rocco turned to Dante. His voice calmer but still edged with pain, and asked for time. He needed space, not just from the situation, but from everyone. He needed time to untangle his own feelings. To figure out where this revelation left him and how to begin understanding this new reality. The idea that he hadn't lost his father but had simply gained a brother was not yet comforting. It was overwhelming. So, he walked out, slowly, but purposefully. Dante watched him go, his heart constricting with every step. He wanted to follow, to offer more words. But he knew nothing he said would make a difference in that moment. He had to let Rocco go, let him grieve, let him process, let him rage if he needed to. Love, Dante knew, couldn't be forced. Relationships, especially those newly revealed and full of pain, couldn't be rushed. All he could do now was hope that the foundation of trust they once shared might someday support something stronger, something new. Gio remained behind. Standing quietly in the space Rocco had just left. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But there was a subtle shift in his posture, a release of tension, a faint but real exhale. Rocco knew now. That simple truth was both terrifying and relieving. Gio wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't a secret. He wasn't a ghost. Whether Rocco wanted him or not, he existed now in the open. And while they hadn't walked out of that room as brothers, they had at least taken the first step toward being something more than strangers. A line had been drawn in the sand, not of division, but of beginning. Not a resolution, but a fragile promise that maybe, in time, something could grow between them. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. And in a family shaped by decades of secrets, that kind of choice might be the rarest gift of all.